Time. A resource both scarce and in abundance. What seems to be infinitely unfathomable will soon be sacred and fleeting as we all slip closer to our time having passed. But hey, let's use some of ours to talk about fighting games, gosh! Timers might be the most universal mechanic among fighting games. Regardless of what you're playing, every one of them will have a system of a clock that goes down as a second passes. Unless you're playing Marvel, which just kind of does its own thing, but I mean, that's fine. What's interesting to me is that this system isn't one that has a lot of room to grow. After all, time advances according to the laws of physics, so it's a bit hard to do a lot with the number go down, but that doesn't mean the ideas around it haven't changed. Early fighting games had timers to stop people from playing forever and declare a winner if both players were less than stellar so that they could force people off of a cabinet and get more quarters in, or pounds, or whatever currency you're using. However, the timer was decidedly long so that people felt like they got their money's worth and people weren't forced out of the arcade before they really got to play with the game. But now we live in the year of our overlord and you can pay £50 for a game and own it forever. If you look at fighting games built in the current era, their timers have different goals. Timers now want to establish feel and encourage certain types of play, even if it's something that you rarely notice. Let's compare two games that are on the opposite ends of the timer philosophy spectrum. Dragonball Fighterz has a timer that doesn't want you to think about it. It's only there if, by some bizarre circumstance, too much time has passed and a winner needs to be declared. By design, it's such an infinitely vast number that it's an unrealistic goal to achieve a timeout. Even intentionally burning the clock is hard, so why didn't they just get rid of it? It's to avoid situations like this. This might seem like a strange comparison to make. After all, Dark Souls isn't even a fighting game, and Dark Souls 3 isn't even as good as the first one, but it still shows us the impacts of not having a timer at all. Without a timer, nobody is encouraged to engage because there's no way to determine a winner without it. Dragon Ball might not have this issue at a competent level of play, and there's a lot of ways to engage which certainly helps to encourage people to play aggressive. But without the timer, it could allow low-level players to get sandbagged to infinity by good players who understand how to block correctly. And so the timer exists in all of its absurdly long glory, clocking in at a total of 6 minutes to encourage people to play closer together and advance more frequently. The timer's length also helps to encourage pushing a lead instead of sitting on one. Why would you take a lead and then turtle if you had to do your best hermit impression for 6 long minutes? 6 minutes is a lot of time that your opponent can use to make mix-ups. Even if your defense is good, given enough time and enough variance, you will eventually slip and have your lead fall like it's a TV infomercial trying to sell stairlifts to the elderly.
I can't get up!
And so you take your lead and you press forward, fearing not the time that is looming until victory, but the potential space between you and it. This would be an example of a game that wants you to play away from the timer and disregard it within strategy. When the time between you and victory by timeout is too vast, it becomes much harder to achieve, and so you cannot rely on being saved by the bell, and so you hit so hard you never have to hear it. Contrast that with a game like Tekken. Not only does Tekken only have a measly 60-second timer, but combos are long, inputs are slow enough to be a snail, and movement is key. Tekken's timer is almost begging to be played into, and whilst damage rivals the heights of the Burj Khalifa, you've got tools to avoid these situations, and playing well in neutral is rewarding. Because of how close the timer is to deciding a winner, it's much easier to play into it with strategy. If you're a character that has very few choices to open up your opponent, why not take space and look for patterns that your opponent has to open themselves up? In doing so, you make any lead that you do achieve valuable not only in damage, but also in time, since now you're forcing your opponent to claw back advantage they don't have with less time, making them forced to make tough decisions, which generally speaking leads to poorer decisions being made. Alternatively, if you're a character that pushes very hard, you can consider the timer a friend in your effort to push someone to make poor defensive decisions. Being pushed constantly never affords your opponent the chance to use the time that's now slipping away from them, and so they'd need to take a risk to re-establish their defense. As you can see, the game wants you to play alongside the timer whether you like it or not, like he's your co-worker that's a bit too interested in rewatching The Human Centipede. Even the most aggressive player will have to deal with this if enough trades don't go their way, and players who don't intend on making too many bold decisions will inevitably fall into it. Games like Ultra 4 land closer to Tekken, since a timeout is still possible under the right circumstances, but it's not common or realistically achievable depending on the matchup. Guilty Gear would end up closer to Dragon Ball, since it's a game that can end so fast that you're almost never going to see a timeout, but within my 500 hours of playing Guilty Gear, I've actually seen a genuine one. But Guilty Gear and Ultra 4 have the same round length. How is that even possible? It's all all about the timer intention mixed with gameplay. Whilst Guilty Gear and Ultra 4 probably had very little thought put into their round time, it's still intentional. For example, if we took a game like Guilty Gear and took the round timer down from 99 seconds to 60 seconds, we'd suddenly have a very different game. Mechanics like negative penalty, which is a mechanic that gets rid of meter and decreases meter gain for jumping back and using runaway options, would suddenly mean very little. Who cares if I lose all my meter for the last 7 seconds of a match if I can just backdash away and his combo takes too long for the timer to go down? This is still a potential scenario and thought process within a 99-second timer, but now it's much more consistent. Why would you try to put your opponent in a dangerous mix-up when you could just shoot balls at him from full screen and YRC when he gets close? Okay, I do this with 99 seconds on the clock, but the strategy's value goes up as time goes down, and starting with less time will push people towards these specific ways of thinking more frequently. And that's not inherently a bad thing, but it's something that the devs would have thought about when they were making the game, you know, like what they want to be good and what they want to be bad. Ono was probably fine with Ultra 4 taking a much more lax approach on time, because he wanted to see how people would play reactive and form strategy around risk-reward. Daisuke wanted people to fuck. Alright, but that's like a developer perspective, and unless you're some of the handful of fighting game devs out there, it's just something interesting to think about. But you're a player. How can you use time to your advantage? Because time is a resource much like any other. The only difference here is that it never goes up and you're always spending. Because of this, you should attempt to recognize how decisions have to change depending on the timer. In a game like Dragon Ball, the timer is so far away that this might never be an issue that you have to think about, but in games that are a bit slower and games that afford you less time to make key decisions, this is a position you're going to be thrown into quite a lot. Because of that, James Smith, as much as you never have this problem in your game, many of us do, so just sit back and enjoy the thought experiment. So let's break down one of the most obvious scenarios first so that you can get a basic idea of what we're going through. Both of you are low, but you have a life lead. Time is running short and your opponent approaches with a relatively safe move, but it's still kind of risky. Your opponent dies and congratulations, you've won the game. But why did your opponent approach? Well, it's because he's fucking running out of time, dum-dum. As time gets down, his potential choices get smaller and smaller. Because of that, he chooses to make a risky advance now, even though it's not the best calculation because of the chances that are slipping away from him. Congratulations, you just got a PhD in play theory and being scared and time, and I wish I could get a PhD and I wasn't a failure. So let's take a less obvious scenario. Let's take a situation that we've all been in, where you're basically even and there's plenty of time on the clock. Surely now time becomes a redundant resource. You're certainly not wrong in that time isn't any sort of immediate danger, but there's a different kind of timer going on in the mind. The mental timer is strange and undefined, as its length and response and reaction changes from person to person. Players who are quite aggressive tend towards having smaller fuses, but are smarter with the pressure that they apply once their fuses burn. Defensive players tend towards having very long mental fuses, but because of that can put themselves in greater long-term danger via positioning and things like that by being too scared to approach. These might not seem like very concrete concepts, so let's use an example. Spin the wheel of what game we'll use as an example. Okay, so in Tekken, right, here at the start of the round I'm going to play a little further back and use my time to see what kind of choices that the opponent wants to make. And I noticed that this guy plays passive for about 2 seconds and then commits to an approach. This guy has a short fuse and plays a character that can benefit from putting your opponent in constant coin flips. I'll take a note of this to help with any similar scenarios that we might end up in. So at the end of the round, we're both put in a pretty dangerous situation where either of us will die from the next interaction because I scuffed a punish. But you might have noticed that I wasn't taking note of what my opponent's type of approach was. Because of that, I don't want the kind of coin flip that he could potentially put me in, so I'm going to press down forward 1 and stuff whatever's coming in, but keep it safe so that if he does end up faking an approach, which would be out of character, I'm still going to be alive. We trade and it's a double KO, so it's not ideal, but I've at least used information from noticing his fuse to make an educated guess. By taking in this information and checking it against what I would consider key points, I can start to build an idea of changes in my opponent's behavior. To me, time is one of these key points that you should be checking against. Knowing what is coming is very important, but you should also hold the same level of importance for when. This is just some of the potential of how I think about time in fighting games and how I think you might want to start considering it too. I don't want to give too many examples of what I think are good and bad uses of time, because I mean my playtime looks like this, but my rank is, you know, this. But I think it's super interesting to think about time as a system and a mechanic to be played around instead of just number go down. So yeah, think about time as more if your game allows you to, because I think it's really engaging to make more active use of your time in games instead of just using the last 15 seconds of a match and going, ah, fuck, oh geez. And at the end of the day, even if you don't, Well, the timer goes down, but subscribers go up, you feel me? Hey! Okay, I'm done.
Ain't nothing like a phone, give me.